for joining us for this Homes for Cathy workshop on Housing First. A very warm welcome back to Kate Farrell. Kate is the Housing-Led Programmes Lead for Crisis and has been working across the country on housing-led homelessness responses. And Kate, who's do they say beaming in, but she's beaming in from Liverpool, and actually was seconded to the Liverpool city region when they were implementing their large-scale Housing First pilot. And I think, Kate, you've worked in homelessness for 15 or 16 years now.
This training with me.
The programme this afternoon is I'm going to be very firmly handing over control to Kate, who will be sharing her screen and going through a presentation with us. She will build in appropriate moments if we need natural breaks. So I think the presentation sort of falls into about 3 sections. And if people are getting, just send me a message. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep an eye on the chat function so that if there are questions as we're going, I think Kate's quite relaxed about that, rather than getting to the end and having to go back. And equally, if somebody else wants to say something, can you put your hand up? And again, I'll try to spot that, or Paula will try to spot that so that we can alert Kate and bring your question at that point. Probably we're all used to it now, but once Kate starts presenting, it'd probably be useful if we all put ourselves on mute so that there's not too much background noise or feedback. I think that's probably all I need to say by introduction. So with that, a warm welcome for Kate, and I'll hand over to her.
Great, thank you very much. Hi everybody, thank you for being here. I think the numbers are right up over 50 now, so this is brilliant. I am just about to share my screen and we will get started. Bear with me on the technology. I had a very good morning with it, so let's hope that continues this afternoon, but I do believe something to do with World Book Day is getting streamed downstairs in this house, so if that interrupts us, I am incredibly sorry. But yeah, thank you, Michael, for the introduction. My name's Kate Farrell, I work for Crisis. I've got a tiny slide here just to give you a sense of who we are in case people aren't aware of that. We're a national homelessness organisation. We're working to try and end homelessness across the UK. Where those little dots are on the map are where we deliver client-facing services. And we also do a huge amount of knowledge and policy work around causes, effects and solutions to homelessness, and also we campaign for change. So I'll have some of that dotted through the presentation today, because around housing-led and housing first interventions, there is still a lot of work needed to be done by UK government to get us where we need to be. As Michael said, I have got experience of delivering and setting up housing first programmes myself, so I'm not just a policy bod, I'm very much used to getting my hands dirty and getting involved in operational detail. And so really I can pitch this anywhere in the kind of gap between those two things. I'm really happy. It's really difficult with some of these larger sessions to feel like it's interactive, but please do interrupt. One of the downsides of being a Scouser is that we can talk for England, so I could just carry on forevermore on housing first, which is one of my favourite topics, so do just jump in. I don't want to be telling people things they already know, and equally I don't want to take up all this time and not answer some of your pressing questions. So hopefully we will get to some of them, but please do feel free to interrupt and interact. I did a session this morning, which some of you might have already heard me talk about, which was with some frontline staff from Broadlands, but also with some local authority staff and housing options staff, just really talking about how they're feeling about the rollout of Housing First in Norfolk. And this is some of the kind of big challenges that we drew out from that session. They're completely to be expected at this stage, I think, but just worth, for the context of those of you that are going to be involved in some of that, just getting a sense of where people are. So really standard things, you know, availability of accommodation choice. How do we provide these things? How do we deal with issues with neighbours and NIMBYism? What about the allocations policy? Is there enough knowledge about Housing First across the county? And then various things to think about around building the right relationships and building trust. How do we get a whole system to think differently? And the big age-old question about queue jumping with Housing First. And I think, you know, we kind of finished off on this in the last session, but it's something that's worth starting with in this one, I think. Sometimes there is a criticism of Housing First that it's queue jumping, and I think that Sam Tessenberis, who is kind of the founder of this approach in New York, addresses that very clearly. and says it is queue jumping, but what we're doing is we're supporting people to rejoin a queue where they really should have been anyway and haven't had the ability to get in. So in the same way that we triage health provision, we provide emergency responses for those who are in the mood that we really need to view housing.
Sorry, no, I've missed part of this meeting.
Okay, I'll let you go.
Okay.
Righty-ho, I'll speak to you another time.
Okay, bye.
First thing that I'm going to ask people to do, and this worked really well this morning, is to try, just so that I get a sense of who's in the room, to use a little bit of a polling device called Menti. So if people can go to www.menti.com, either on their phone or on another screen on their laptop, it will ask you for a code. And the code that you need to put in is 9370050. And I'll jump out of this screen and I'll share the Menti screen, and we should get a sense of where people on this call are up to with their current knowledge of Housing First. Partly it helps me, but partly it helps each other as well, to get a sense of where people are.
Sorry, I didn't take the code down quick enough. Can you, Sarah, show us it again?
Yeah, it's fine. It's at the top of this screen also.
Ah, okay.
Can you see it?
8655. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a different question, Kate.
Oh, sorry, I've shared the wrong one. Bear with me, sorry. Let me stop sharing for 1 second. I've given you a preview of the next one. Let me share this one. Share screen. Here we go. And as you should see, this is already populating.
I can't get into the other screen. I'm going to have to try and do it on another computer.
If you've got a mobile phone, it works really well on a mobile.
It might do, except I've got a new work mobile phone and I can't work it myself. So
There we go. Does seem to be working for most
now
people.
my other computer won't open. Let me just try and go in. Let's copy this.
Don't panic. If everybody doesn't get a chance to vote, it doesn't really matter. It's more to just get a sense of where people are in the room. We'll use it again later on with a different code to ask a slightly different question.
I know a lot about Housing First, so if you can adjust that for me, but I do.
We'll add that to the column then. We'll assume an extra person in the blue wedge.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so we've got a few real experts in the room. We've got a few real novices, and then everybody else is somewhere in the middle, knowing a little bit. So I'm hoping that I'm not going to bore anybody to death. And I'm also hoping that I'm not going to jump in and pitch it at the level where people are still confused at the end. If I do either of those things, please feel free to interrupt me. But thank you all for kind of jumping onto Menti. It's got a load of different functions. We'll use a couple today, but it's something that I've been finding really useful to get a bit of audience feedback when I'm doing this kind of session. So let me stop sharing that screen and go back to the presentation. Okay. Here we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about housing-led systems with Housing First at their core. Now, for those of you that already know about Housing First, this might feel really kind of standard practice to you, but I'm going to just frame it in the way that we always do at Crisis. As you might have gathered from my job title, we talk a lot about housing-led, but in other areas of the country, particularly Scotland, they talk about rapid rehousing, and essentially it's the same thing. And systems that are based on rapid rehousing or housing-led approaches are about ending homelessness as quickly as possible by getting somebody into their own home, and providing with them the support that they need to make that work. So it involves minimising the amount of time people spend in temporary accommodation, and also minimising the number of moves. And I think that's really key for some of the systems that we currently need to unpick a little bit. It means that somebody has to move as few times as possible before they get a permanent home that they can call their own. Housing First is a form of housing-led intervention, but it isn't the only one. And I think sometimes where we fall down is assuming that everything housing led has to be housing first and be really high fidelity and meet all those principles. That won't be right for everybody. And housing first is really designed for people with the most complex needs. And sometimes we're having big system level conversations. The idea of the cost of housing first or the small caseloads is really a blocker in people thinking that this is how you can do the whole system. And I think therefore that differentiation is really key. We talk a lot about Finland being completely housing first, and actually Finland is completely housing led whilst providing housing first for those people that need it. So housing led means being able to look first at the housing first principles. So although that fidelity model might not need to be stuck to as rigidly for housing led, it is all born from the same principles. The difference is one of degree. So housing first services are targeted at specific small cohorts and includes all people getting out of homelessness. For housing led, it's the whole system. And it's a way of working with individuals. So if those housing first principles underpin the way that your services work with people, then we know that there will be more successful in ending homelessness. And this is a little diagram that I've stolen ruthlessly from the Scottish Housing First pilots, but really gives that idea of turning up the dial. So where we know that people have the most complexity of need, we need to give them the most support available. That is a pure kind of high fidelity housing first model. But the scale of support is the only thing that changes in a housing-led system. But those same principles around lack of moves quickly as possible into permanent housing underpin a housing-led system. Housing-led isn't just about getting people off the streets and into hostels and shelters. It's not about placing people in temporary accommodation for long periods of time. I think crucially, and particularly Christ have done a lot of work around how we define homelessness. We are continuing to define homelessness as people in temporary accommodation remain homeless until they are permanently housed.
Kate, can
Yes.
I just ask, there's a question in the chat whether we're able to share the slides afterwards. Are you okay with us doing that?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem at all.
That's great. It just saves people scribbling if they know now.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said that at the start. Please don't try and write all this down. Don't try and catch up with my speech patterns. Just we'll share them at the end. So housing people quickly without consideration of tenancy sustainment, that isn't housing led. I think sometimes actually, particularly because of the rapid rehousing terminology, there has been a misinterpretation that the quicker you house somebody, the better. That's not always right. And that's something that we had to have many an argument with central government on during the housing first pilots, that actually the key indicator shouldn't be speed, it should be sustainability. It's not about erecting rigid barriers to affordable housing based on past behaviour. We have to be flexible. It's not about using treatment first or tenancy ready or staircased approaches. They are fairly hardwired into the way that we do things, and really unpicking that and how we can do things as housing first rather than treatment first as possible is really key. And it isn't treating all single homeless people as if they have a support need. And that's the really clear thing. I think sometimes it can be really easy to extrapolate the cost of housing first and assume that that whole system now needs to have a huge additional investment. Actually, where we've done significant piece of research, what you find is that we are over providing support to some people and under providing to others. And if we can right that balance, we tend to do better with the budgets that we've got. And certainly being housing led is not only for local authorities to implement, and that's a really key one. I think sometimes there is a feeling that this all sits on the shoulders of local authorities, and this has got to be around partnership, community working for the right solutions for the right people. So having talked about housing led systems, it is worth just focusing down on housing first, really understanding who it's for. This is a fairly basic diagram, just saying that these are the kinds of experiences you would expect people who are in need of housing first to come with. You know, we're really talking about the most entrenched people essentially who have been cycling around the systems that we've got and not getting the support that they need. Quite often when housing first was talked about in the US, when it was first designed, talked about people who were treatment resistant. Or hard to engage people. I don't really like that terminology. I think we need to work out that the responsibility is on us as a service provider to create the right services for people. So there are people that we have been failing to provide the right solution for, and Housing First should give some more choice and control back to the individuals. A Housing First approach, for those of you that said that they weren't familiar with this, and apologies to those of you that said they know a lot, you're going to have to listen to my interpretation again and look at these diagrams again. But essentially, in its most basic form, a Housing First approach is about removing conditionality from the homelessness system. So the diagram on the left is the one that was kind of made famous by Pathways in New York, who invented this approach really about 25 years ago. And it's about taking away the requirement for people to go through multiple layers of temporary accommodation in order to get the kind of golden prize of permanent housing. The diagram on the right has been produced by HomelessLink and Housing First England. I steal their infographics regularly as well because they're good. And that shows us the difference between our traditional support model, which quite often will involve night shelters, hostels, some form of transitional housing. I think, you know, you could have prison stays and all kinds of things into people's journeys there. And what Housing First does, it removes the necessity to do those things. And actually, if you are rough sleeping, you can move directly into permanent accommodation. If you are without housing, you can move directly without having to be at the bottom of all of those waiting lists, or to comply with conditionality in services that, to be honest, if we looked at the statistics, we would know there are people who are never going to be able to get to the top of that ladder. And so that Housing First is about providing a different solution for those that we know we're essentially continuing to offer the wrong thing to. A really, really big difference with Housing First to other things is about the intensity of support. So I think, you know, it's been really intellectualised, Housing First, and there's huge amounts of academic writing about Housing First, but really it's about building strong, trusting relationships and having the time and capacity to invest in them. And the way to do that is by having small caseloads. So what we say in England is that a caseload for proper high fidelity Housing First should be between 5 and 7. And where we see in traditional support models, quite often we've got floating support caseloads of between 20 and 40. To be honest, this slide is probably out of date. I've seen floating support services that have caseloads of up to 70 people. I think you'd be doing really well to have any kind of trusting relationship with that number of people at one time. And Housing First is really about doubling down on giving people time to build those relationships. It's underpinned by a set of principles, and I'll talk through these in a little more depth later on. I don't want to kind of bore people that know a huge amount about them, but essentially where we're looking at any kind of Housing First delivery, for it to be truly Housing First, it must adhere to these principles. And we were talking a lot this morning about where there have been missteps with Housing First, where maybe services aren't meeting the outcomes that we would expect to see. And it can always be taken back to these principles and where did we not apply the right principles. I used to work with somebody who used to talk about these being the ingredients in a cake. And essentially, Housing First won't come out right if you don't put all the ingredients in. It can't be missing one of these things. We have to do as much as we can to get as close to fidelity to these things as possible. So the right to a home, this assumption that people don't have to be housing ready, that by sheer fact of them being unhoused, that they have a right to a home, that flexible support is provided for as long as is needed. And I realise that's a real difficulty with commissioning cycles the way that they are, particularly not helped by the Next Steps programme and the way that central government have structured the funding for that. Very happy to talk about that as we go through. The other one is that housing and support needs to be separated. And again, we're not very good at this in homelessness services, but it's really standard practice in other places. Individuals having choice and control, and where you can build in that choice and control into every single element, you will see better outcomes as far as tenancies sustained in Housing First. We need to take an active engagement approach. So that's about saying that housing and support are optional. The support element is not going to, not wanting to engage in support is not going to mean that your property is at risk, but we will actively try to engage you in that support, because you would not be on a Housing First programme if you yourself hadn't recognised that you had support needs and that we knew as professionals that there were things that we could help you with. That a service should be based on people's strengths, goals and aspirations. So absolutely not deficit based. You cannot have until you can prove. and that a harm reduction approach is used. And again, this is really familiar terminology for people that are used to working with drug and alcohol support services, but actually Housing First in itself is a harm reduction approach. It is safer to be housed than it is to be a rough sleeper. We can prove that through evidence and statistics. The numbers of people who died homeless last year were published fairly recently, and they were shockingly bad. And actually we know it's an inherently dangerous thing to do, to sleep rough, and the more that we can do to house more people, the more harm that we can reduce. So the next section is me talking a little bit about the evidence base for Housing First. Hopefully this will be useful for those of you that know a little bit more about it, but also will give a bit of confidence to those that are still learning. This next slide has got an embedded video, so let's hope that any second now I get a little arrow that I can click and it means that it will start playing. Here we go, good. And I will, it's a couple of years out of data, just want to say that to start with. So some of the statistics in it are a little bit wrong. None of them have got better, they've all got worse. So try not to be too depressed by that. But this talks a little bit just around how Finland have taken a housing-led approach right across the country and how that's booked the trend for Europe.
Right now we're experiencing a homelessness crisis right across Great Britain. There are more than 300,000 homeless people in the UK, equivalent to 1 in every 200. Finland is one of the very few nations globally that through the last decade has seen a decrease in the number of homeless people. Since 2009, the UK has seen an 169% increase in rough sleeping, while Finland's statistics have gone down by 18% in the same amount of time. Since October last year, we've had an average of 3 people die every week on our streets. This is not a problem exclusive to the UK. All over Europe, homelessness is on the rise. Earlier this year, the government published their new Homelessness Reduction Plan, which has the goal of ending homelessness by 2027. One of the initiatives in the plan is to pilot the Housing First model, inspired by Finland.
We believe that everyone deserves a home of their own, no matter where you come from or what your economical status is.
The Nordic country is the only EU state not suffering from a housing crisis, which is a result of Finland's Housing First initiative, which started in 2008.
The Housing First model has become a starting point in combating homelessness. Life of the homeless has been humanized. In the Housing First model, home is seen as a right, not as a reward, as it often is in other EU countries.
The Finnish system is financed by public funds and Finnish slot machines, and the idea of Housing First is quite simple. When people are homeless, you give them housing first. A home right away, instead of lots of paperwork and temporary accommodation. Housing First uses ordinary housing, such as private rental flats, and is designed to get the most vulnerable homeless people off the streets.
If there is one thing the UK could learn from Finland, it is this. Everyone needs and deserves a home. And if we provide young people with one, it is much easier for them to start addressing other challenges in their lives.
But what do you think? Is it possible to end homelessness in the UK? And are we...
Sorry, a little bit of an abrupt end to that one. Hopefully everybody could hear that all right. I think it talks quite well about the right space of Housing First and really kind of readjusting our mind from housing being a reward to being something that people have a right to. Just to give a little bit of policy context and do the kind of policy update on this, where we really started to see talk of Housing First in the UK was following the introduction of the Homelessness Reduction Act and the rough sleeping strategy, as you'll see here. Many of you will be really familiar with these pieces of legislation and the plans that have come out from central government, but certainly the 2017 Homelessness Reduction Act placed a greater burden on local authorities around preventing homelessness. Essentially, Housing First and Housing Led, when done properly, are a preventative intervention. We will do a lot of relief through them, but actually, if those interventions work, it prevents future homelessness. And where we're addressing homelessness at the moment, what we're doing is addressing the same people's homelessness time and time again. Duty to refer, unfortunately, did not include housing associations, which we think was a real missed opportunity there, because that kind of idea of preventing homelessness where people are due to be evicted would have been a really key one. We know lots and lots of good practice exists where that has been adopted regardless, but if it had been enshrined into law, it would have made our lives a bit easier. But that thought for local authorities in moving away from gatekeeping behaviours that had been incentivised through the previous legislation is really key for this idea of housing first to be something that we can focus on. The rough sleeping strategy that came out in 2018 really crucially is not a homelessness strategy. This government are very, very fixated on the idea of reducing and dealing with rough sleeping, not necessarily about permanently ending people's homelessness. That is a challenge for housing first and housing led aspirations, and I'm sure stuff that people on this call are really familiar with. Again, very happy to talk about some of that moving forward, but they did commit to halving rough sleeping during the parliamentary term and ending rough sleeping by 2027, which is feeling like it's getting much, much closer than it was when we first started talking about that. What Christ have done around housing first and housing led really started with our feasibility study in the Liverpool City region in 2017. As Michael said in the introduction, I was quite heavily involved in that piece of work at the time. I was running all of Christ's services based up in Merseyside, and I eventually ended up being seconded over to the newly formed Liverpool City Region Combined Authority to implement a housing led approach across the city region, including the English Housing First pilot there. It was an incredibly challenging time. It wasn't universally accepted, this report. So the piece of work that we did that led to my secondment looked at what it would cost to stop doing essentially what homeless systems did across the newly forming Liverpool City region, which at that stage wasn't functioning as one unit. And to develop a model that over time would free up resources by doing exactly what I said earlier, which was providing the right support to the right people in order to ultimately stop that revolving door. As you can imagine, it caused huge discussion and debate across the city region, and many people felt very protective and defensive of some of the things that it showed. What it showed was that we were repeatedly failing the same people, and everybody in the system had to take some responsibility for that, and that was quite a difficult journey to tread. What it did do though was prompt MHCLG to fund the English Housing First pilots. We made a compelling enough evidence base for HM Treasury to think that there was something in this. We were also quite lucky at the time that Sajid Javid was Home Secretary and was Secretary of State, sorry, and had spent some time in Finland looking at their quite radically different outcomes based on a housing-led approach. So we had the ear of government enough to fund a pilot, although if we'd had the ear well enough, they would have known that pilots weren't really the thing for housing first, and what you need is full-scale system change. We're just coming out of the back of another feasibility study in Oxfordshire. And interestingly, fast forward those 4 years, and what we've got is now more of an idea of housing first being a part of a housing-led system, and the kind of need to look at it through that perspective. There are quite a few pockets of housing first delivery across Oxfordshire, but they are not ending enough people's homelessness, and they really wanted to look at this from the sense of how do they look at system-wide transformation. What we found through this feasibility study was that actually only 8% of all the funding that went into homelessness services in Oxfordshire were spent on floating support, and that tells you an awful lot that we're funding a lot of buildings but we're not funding a lot of flexibility. That actually only 13% of people each year that were going through homelessness services were crucially moving into settled accommodation. And if what we take as the aim of homelessness services is to end people's homelessness, 13% is not good enough. And really woefully, actually, in Oxfordshire, only 3% of all social housing lettings were going to people that were moving out of supported accommodation. That tells us two things, I think. I think one, that the allocations policies aren't right, and that the lettings processes aren't meeting the need, but also that all that money that we pump into supported accommodation is not really a step in a journey to permanent housing. That what we're doing is we're spending a lot of money on supported accommodation and people have got no route out. And so if we look at it through that dial of support, there has to be people in there where the support's not enough. but also there'll be people in there where we're over providing support because they are incentivized to continue to require support in order to stay housed. And that is that's a real problem, and it's something that we see repeated around the country. What that study has done is recommended a total shift to a housing-led, lots more funding, floating support, really tracking data at a level that we can see whose homelessness we're ending. And I'm continuing to work with Oxfordshire on some of that. Where we are around Housing First in the UK is quite a different picture in the home nation. So England, there is no national policy yet on Housing First, and I think we see that quite clearly reflected. If there was a kind of coherent national policy on Housing First, we would not continue to see short-term funding for Housing First, because there would be an understanding that Housing First is a long-term intervention. There are 3 large-scale pilots that have been funded, so Greater Manchester, West Midlands, Liverpool City region, and those pilots were initially funded for 3 years. That funding has been extended and it's now a 5-year programme. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before the end of them to say, and now what? Scotland are in a completely different position. They do have national policy to end homelessness. Every local authority is required to have a rapid rehousing plan, which means shifting their services to be housing-led. Lots of them include Housing First. And at the same time, they've had a national Pathfinder programme to run Housing First at scale in 5 cities, and they've just hit their 400th tenancy on that, and they're working at a 0% eviction rate. There've been no evictions yet from that programme, so really are kind of head and shoulders above the English approach in Scotland. They're doing everything they can to become the kind of Scandinavia of the UK, I think, and they're really learning from what was done in Finland. Wales are in a different place again, so there is a national commitment to Housing First, but there's no national funding yet. But there is a new national accreditation, so they're going very much down a quality route in Wales, and we're watching this very closely, where providers of Housing First are required to meet a certain accredited standard. Clearly, the concern with that is that once you've got it, can you maintain it, and how do they continue to make sure those standards remain high? But a really interesting approach to how they're tackling kind of rollout of Housing First. Housing First England, which is part of Homeless Link, have just published their kind of State of the Nation report on Housing First for 2020. This is their infographic that I've stolen. But as you'll see, they're saying that there's 105 Housing First services in England. They're supporting more than 2,000 people. And 45% of them have been running for more than 2 years. So we are in quite a markedly different position than we were even just a couple of years ago. The growth of Housing First is fairly rapid in England, although it isn't being governed by any national policy as such yet.
Kate, Catherine Little has a question in chat. Catherine, do you want to say what the question is?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. I was just referring back to Oxfordshire, and I always find it interesting what they've managed to achieve there. Partly because of the similarities to Norfolk, in that it's the first place in England, I think, that's done this, that's got the kind of dual layer local authority. It's got the county and it's got the district authorities. And, you know, having lived and worked there myself, I know there's real political differences between the districts. They haven't always traditionally worked brilliantly together. I just wonder what issues those points threw up to the work that they're successfully doing, and what points there might be to learn from that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think they're still on a journey. You know, it's certainly not all cracked, but there is absolutely a willingness to work together. Having tried to do this kind of work in 2 different areas, one where they are all very politically aligned on paper and one where they're not, it's actually been quite interesting to me that where you would expect to see lots of turmoil, actually there's been a lot less than there was when we tried to do this in Liverpool City region, where everybody technically is of the same political persuasion. I think that actually they're very data-led, and that's really helped. So that work, you know, the fact they wanted to invest in that big piece of feasibility work is interesting in itself. That was commissioned by the county council and you know, all the local authorities together. In Liverpool, that is not the case. We did it as a third sector provider with the Housing First Hub for Europe and some funding from MHCLG, actually, because they were looking at a kind of proof of concept study. So I think having that buy-in from very early on was very clear. They've been very data-led. It's very hard to argue with some of those stark figures where there's a lot of money, you know, that those at the councils there who are under real financial pressure. And I get the sense that that's more of a, that's a more recent concern than it has been in other areas that I've maybe worked. And so actually they're really keen that they want to get value for their spend, and that you can't look at the figures that they're seeing through their combined systems and think that that offers value. They also, I guess, one of the benefits of the county council model there is that they have got responsibility for a lot more health services. And so looking at this through a health lens, actually the harm reduction approach really chimes, but also from a harm reduction and adult safeguarding perspective, sadly, they've had a lot of deaths in their homelessness services over the past couple of years. And so there is a real focusing of minds that the status quo can't continue. So I think all of those things are combined to make that quite helpful. There's a whole load of fun governance conversations going on at the moment, and I think that's going to be, I'm pushing them quite strongly that loose governance won't get us where we need to get to on this. And some of that kind of unpicking and restitching governance around this is painful because it involves so many cabinet meetings, but actually is really necessary, because who owns this? If this is an aspiration for the whole county, who owns it? How are they accountable? And how do we monitor it? And without the right body for that, I think they are going to struggle. So that would be the big kind of takeaway for me from there. And yeah, data. How do we show that what we try is showing some kind of benefit in the kind of flows of people in and out of services?
Thank you.
So from the Housing First England report on 2020 that I've just talked about in the infographic, this is just giving a bit of a spread of where we are in England. So there are Housing First services in every region of the country now, which is a real positive step. Most of the services are in the southeast, which is not that surprising, but actually the highest number of people being supported are in the northwest. But I think that is explained quite easily by the fact that 2 of the England pilot areas are up there, or here, I should say. I'm still sat here. On average, the services are supporting between 6 and 20 people. So what we're seeing is lots of very small Housing First services popping up, but some of them range to over 250, and those England pilots will all be housing more than 250 over their duration. 71% of services have caseloads of 6 or less, which is an excellent sign of fidelity. It's interesting how they cut that. So we have an ongoing conversation, let's say, with Homeless Link about where we want to draw the line on fidelity. To my mind, caseloads of more than 7, we are struggling to call them Housing First. And so if Homeless Link had cut that at 7, I would be interested to see what the percentage is. 71% under 6 is great. Anything above that, I think we do need to start questioning the fidelity of the model to Housing First, and whether or not that is just a housing-led service and not a Housing First service. 81% of those Housing First services are using social housing for their residents. That's really increased. It's really great to see the social housing sector stepping up to the challenge of Housing First. But 45% of services are using accommodation from more than one source. And I think that is really important, particularly where we think and look at choice for individuals. There are still swathes of towns and cities that aren't covered by social housing, that there won't be appropriate 1-bed property. And so we shouldn't rule out the use of private rented sector where it provides additional choice. But obviously there is then a consideration around tenure and stability of tenancies. There has just been, and some of you may have seen this, although it has only been published very recently, a new report been published by the Centre for Social Justice, and they've called it Close to Home, and it's really about calling for a national rollout of Housing First in England to get ahead of the end of those England pilots, to answer that question of now what. It includes evidence from those 3 city region pilots, but also they've case studied Scotland and Finland, where they've taken a much more nationalised approach. And what the report has aimed to do is to draw out where that has led to kind of increased successes and what the recommendations should therefore be for England. It focuses on Housing First being one part of a wider strategic response to homelessness. From that report, I've stolen this graph, which is where we've tried to map the need for Housing First and the Housing First places that currently exist in each region. So you will see in crisis communication quite regularly the fact that we say there's about 16.5 Housing First tenancies needed. And what you'll see also is other people commenting on Twitter and Facebook to say, but there's hundreds of thousands of homeless people. What we're not saying is that there's only 16,500 homes needed. What we're saying is for people that really need high fidelity, very, very intensive support, this is our best estimation. And this is where we think the demand is. So as you can see, nowhere is anywhere close to supply meeting demand, but it's a useful breakdown. That's quite kind of fairly new information that we've been able to pull through some of the research that we've been doing. A bit more detail, I think, really around what the CSJ report is calling for, because I think this is the crux of how we get from where we are now to where we might aspire to be as a country. Sustainable funding for support, and this is a real biggie. I used to say this regularly to MHCLG civil servants, that actually the system change required for Housing First, that they're part of it. And so them continuing to give out piecemeal funding has driven a lot of the behaviour that we've seen in the system. So this is not about us bashing providers and saying, none of you are providing longevity of support. It's saying that given the way that your funding trickles down, you've been painted into a corner, but the evidence tells us that's not the right way to approach this. That MHCLG are the ones that have to step up. So what this report suggests, and it's interesting that it's come from the CSJ, I think they are a kind of right-wing think tank. They're very closely aligned to the Conservative Party. We tend to be quite kind of shouty and radical and kind of third sector about things. They are a little bit more measured. So it's interesting what they came up with as recommendations. In the first instance, they are suggesting 3 years of cross-departmental funding to really recognise that Housing First can't just keep being managed by MHCLG, that actually health needs to play a role in this, criminal justice needs to play a role in this, etc. They're using those figures that I've just discussed, so calling on a national target of 16,450. And they think there should be generic and targeted services. We've seen really good outcomes where there are Housing First services for women or for young people, or for people who wish to remain abstinent, or for people leaving prison. And I think that, what they've funded so far are big generic programmes, and we need some focus in there. They want to incentivise multi-agency commissioning and cross-border working again. Quite often we're talking about the hardest to help for Housing First, and quite often what we're seeing in the city region pilots is that people do not have the ability to reintegrate into a community where everybody knows them and has got a real preconception of them. So where we can cross local authority borders, that's incredibly helpful. And then to prepare a plan for longer term funding from year 4 to really fund national rollout. The other thing that they're calling for is an increase in supply of social and private rent for Housing First. So to bring forward £12.2 billion of affordable homes programme with a social rent focus. Flexibility to extend rough sleeper accommodation programme, otherwise known as Next Steps tenancies. We know this is a huge challenge. They asked in the prospectus for people to provide more Housing First support in this, with this funding package, and then what they said is that the tenancies could only be for 2 years. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of what high fidelity Housing First is. We are raising that with them. We have continued to, but actually CSJ are now doing that, and that's very, very interesting. That's a key recommendation from this report. Housing First clients moving into social housing should be matched by additional provision. What we can't do is say that all 1 beds in social housing now need to go to Housing First tenants. We have to boost those supply chains. We have to match that with additional provisions so that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. Got to prioritise early engagement with housing providers to address allocations and management issues. There's really good practice coming out of those large scale pilots about what good looks like around flexible allocations, policies and management issues. We need to learn that, we need to embed that in good practice, and we need to support people to be able to adapt their systems for that. And they're saying around more investment to support social lettings agencies, and that's really around giving some security of tenure for private rented sector provision for Housing First. Some really interesting leasing models that are coming to the fore, and we're actually doing a piece of work, Crisis are, to look at how we can increase one bed stock for Housing First nationally, and doing some more in-depth work on that. The other thing that the CSJ report calls for is national stewardship, so an oversight across government with wider stakeholders, that it aligns with a strategic response to end homelessness nationally and locally, which clearly at the moment it does not, because the focus is just on rough sleepers, it's not on ending homelessness. That there should be a national implementation plan, there should be shared vision grounded in that high fidelity approach. That, you know, that's interesting, that's really learning from Wales, that actually quality matters in Housing First. We can't just allow people to bundle up and call things Housing First that aren't. That there should be a workforce development plan, including peer support, so learning from people with their own lived experience. How do we need to think differently? How do we need to provide different solutions when the ones we've been providing so far have not worked? A commitment to shared learning. Scotland are really leading the way on that. They are treating this as a national learning programme, and it really shows. Commitment to embedding co-production and with communities, but also with people with lived experience, and outcomes of monitoring and quality assurance. And I think that's really key for this. It has to be around, did we do it right, and was the quality high? So they're calling for national outcomes of monitoring, so standardised national framework of what good looks like, addressing housing, criminal justice, health, wellbeing and employment outcomes. So crucially not targeting them, but monitoring them very closely. They want headline results published regularly, and that's been a big criticism of the national pilots, that actually they've been quite silent and we don't really know what's happened within them. And a national quality assurance framework. So to focus on fidelity and outcomes, there should be self-assessment tools, performance benchmarking, and a training academy and accredited qualifications, again, really looking at what they've done in Scotland and Wales for what good looks like. Okay. That's the end of my kind of roundup of where we are at the moment and a kind of policy recap. Hopefully that's been helpful. I don't know if now feels like a good time for a break, Michael.
Shall we take literally a 2-minute break if anyone's desperate to go and use the loo? I don't know, whilst we're waiting for everyone to get back, whether you want to just talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, I can. I stopped sharing my screen so that I could have a little ponder. Somebody's already answered the first one for me, I think. So somebody asked, you did, Michael. Somebody asked what rough sleep and what RSAP stood for, and it is the Rough Sleep and Accommodation Programme. It's really varying in different bits of the country where I'm speaking to people. I'd been calling it the Next Steps Programme, and other people have suddenly started calling it the RSAP. I think it depends who your MHCLG special advisor is, to be blunt, but it's all the same thing. So that's what we're talking about there, and you know, the fundamental issue within that it's asking for housing-led and Housing First initiatives, but it's only wanting to support tenancies for 2 years. Somebody might have to help me with the next one. So the next one is around working with the 2020 initiative to provide homes. I'm not sure I'm aware of that. So is that Fran? Can you help me out with that a little bit? I mean, I assume the answer is no, because I don't really know what it is.
To say something, I went on some training, I don't know, probably good 6 months ago, and they spoke then, and basically what they do, they use pension funding to buy houses, and then you use the housing allowance to repay it. So effectively it doesn't cost you anything really. And I just wondered if anyone had actually used that process to actually buy homes for homeless people. And obviously then it ultimately the house would become part of your housing stock. The way it was projected was that there would be no real cost to the local authority unless, or you know, the property was empty for any period of time, which obviously you wouldn't look to promote. So yeah, the housing,
the local authority pension fund to buy housing.
No. This was they've got a website. It's just, if you just Google 2020 initiative, it's an ex-government minister, Labour minister, I believe, who sort of heading this up, and I can't remember his name now. I'm actually looking at their website on my phone as I'm speaking. But basically, it says on their website that the 2020 initiative starts with the premise that access to a permanent home is a basic human right, and permanent houses is provided to homeless first rather than last. And then obviously, as I say, the way they do it, they access money from pension funds. That's how they pay for this. Obviously, they guarantee to give people, you know, the pension funds, let's say 3% return on their money, and they use the money to buy houses, which can be in your local authority. So, I mean, in very simple terms.
That's worth us finding out about. It may be related to some of the for-profit RPs as well, like Legal and General stepping into the market. But I'm going to grab that link from you, Fran, and we'll have a look at it and see if we need to have a session on it.
I was just on that initiative, I'm not aware of them as a particular initiative, but that model is becoming much more prevalent. Chris Hancock is the person that you need from Crisis to talk to you about that. He knows everything there is to know about financing of private rental sector income. I leave that to him and don't worry too much. But essentially, our biggest concern with those models is that they are basically raising private equity to invest in what they call affordable housing. But the vast majority of those models, in order to wash their face, rely on exempt level of of rental. So it isn't within LHA rates, and it isn't within rents for people. And what that does is it traps people in a cycle of having to pay really high level rents backed by HB, and actually it can be a significant drain on local authority resource.
We'll do a bit of investigation about that. You had a question a bit further up. I don't know, which might have missed, which is what are you meaning by secure housing?
Sorry. Yeah, so again, you know, we don't have a sort of national terminology for this. It would be helpful as part of a national framework if we did. Where we talk about you know, housing first from the US model, we talk about secure permanent housing. In an ideal world, what that looks like is a lifetime tenancy in a social housing property for a UK context. They are fewer and further between than they have previously been. But what we mean is secure housing that isn't dependent on a set date for move out, and also isn't dependent on you continuing to require a level of support. And that is the problem with those exempt models, that as soon as you don't need that support, you've got a problem. So the shorthand for secure housing means that a house that you can stay in regardless of what your need is, and that there is no set time that you need to move out of it. Now, clearly, where we're talking about private rented sector, that and also social in some circumstances, that depends on the terms of your tenancy agreement and the length of your tenancy. But that's what we mean, that there's no conditionality on it based on a requirement to need high level support or to be supported by a certain organisation.
Brilliant. Carolyn Howell. Carolyn, are you still with us? Because you have a question about funding and rental charges stroke revenue.
Yeah, and actually it kind of follows on from what you've just said, actually. I suppose listening to this and getting my head around this as a sort of accommodation-based support provider, we're going to have to, if we want to adopt this sort of housing-led approach, we are going to have to be kind of really brave about this, because you know, some of our income levels, unfortunately, are linked to enhanced housing payments, etc., mainly because the grant funding, etc., for the actual support has become more challenging in recent years. And I appreciate that is, you know, that's a cost to the DWP, essentially, isn't it? And it can cause challenges for people who want to then transition into work, because then obviously they can't afford that, and we need to change the way we're charging, really. I suppose what I'm saying is, if you've got any advice about how an organisation that's structured like that could transition and be financially viable, really, based on a completely different way of funding what we currently do, particularly if we're separating out support from housing management as well.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it is a significant challenge for the transition from how we currently fund things to how we are suggesting that we move to. Wherever we've done a kind of large scale feasibility study, so the Oxfordshire one, the Liverpool one, also one that we did in Torbay, we cost out what we think the cost of the transition would be. So they're worth looking at. Clearly, this isn't something that any organisation can do on their own. It really needs a change of direction. So in Oxfordshire, where we're looking at this, there's a whole load of conversation now around what that new commissioning structure looks like, and really working with the providers to look at where there are challenges for their individual finances because of the way that the funding has been stacked up. There is clearly a need for some level of transitional funding, but ultimately we're trying to make the compelling argument that this is cheap, that it's a kind of prevent to save model. So unless what we're happy with is that we continue to make sure that everybody that has any support needs to pay really above market rent, then what are we going to do to shift out of that? And so there will be a period of time where there needs to be almost dual funding to fund both models, but we should be able to move past it. I mean, the elephant in the room here is, what we need is more social housing, and what we need is more one-bed social housing. And I think that is that's something that hasn't landed strong enough at all with some of the work that we've been doing yet on Housing First. And so within, thinking about who I'm speaking to in this group, local authorities, housing associations, how do we make sure that every time we can add to that one bed portfolio, we're doing it? And how do we challenge our development colleagues to do that? How do we challenge our planning committees to do that? Because fundamentally without it, we're all fishing in a small pond, and therefore what happens is it just gets more and more and more expensive, because that's what happens with the kind of free market. So it's not an easy one. That we have done a lot of financial modelling on it. I think for individual organisations, if this is something that you want to aspire to, then it's about thinking about your funding sources. Looking at trusts and funds that are willing to, and wanting to fund things this way. There are some out there now, Nationwide Foundation and Lloyds Bank Foundation fund lots of things because they've got an aspiration to do housing-led work, as do Oak Foundation. So there are funding streams out there that are supportive of a housing-led transition. It's just about kind of looking around for them. We're continuing to do work around this, around that financial modelling, and my colleague Chris is doing a huge amount on it. So keep your eyes on our blogs and those kind of things, because we do publish on this quite regularly.
Another quick question, which you might know the answer of, which sort of moves on actually from your one-bedroom comment, I suppose, is the housing-led approach being applied to families as well as single people in places like Finland? So single people work quite well with one-bedroom, families less so.
Yeah, Housing First is really about singles, and we talk about that a lot. Interestingly, in Canada, they really don't make that distinction. So there's a huge amount of housing-led and Housing First work done with families. To be honest, in Finland, the whole system's just housing-led, so it applies to families as much as singles, but they don't call it Housing First as such. It's more just availability. It is an interesting question. The thing in England and why we focus so much on singles is obviously because of the statutory duty tends to support families more so than it does singles. Obviously in Scotland, they changed that law, their legislation changed, so they are looking at both. Housing First for families isn't something that happens a huge amount, but housing led absolutely should be how we aspire to support families. And to be honest, we are closer to supporting families in that way in England, the way that the law's written at the moment, although we know that there are transitional steps because of supply, but they tend not to be around compliance to certain support programs or tenancy readiness. We're not doing a huge amount of holding families because of their readiness. It's more to do with policies, flow of stock, etc. So yeah, it has been used. Canada's a really interesting one because obviously in Canada and the US, they have a completely different system for us. So you do end up with homeless families. Ireland is another one. Ireland, shockingly, don't have any protection for families in their homelessness legislation. So you have children that rough sleep in Ireland, which is a really quite shocking thing to see. They've done a lot of work around Housing First and housing-led work for families, particularly Dublin City.
And there's a few more comments and questions in the chat, but I think we're going to have to move on. But I think I'm going to truncate to one, which is there guidance on who Housing First would not be suitable for?
That's an interesting one. I don't think there's anybody that a housing-led approach is not appropriate for. I think what we need to be careful about is not applying Housing First to people that don't have that level of complexity, because it's too expensive apart from anything else. You don't need to do it that way. And what it will do is it will make the whole thing undeliverable. The only exception to that, so there's a couple of things. One is to say that where we see international success rates and sustainability rates of between 80 and 100%, it's where fidelity has been adhered to very closely. What I would say is if your fidelity is not high and you're not providing high quality housing first, it would be it would be wrong to try and provide it for people with really, really complex needs, because we know we would under provide support. However, there are people within Housing First who, you know, there's a 20% there, aren't there, that it doesn't work for. Most of the intelligence on that is where there is a care need that is too high. So quite often, particularly in an English context, and I'm seeing this more and more with the work that I'm doing, adult social care are nowhere to be seen for complex individuals like this. And so actually where people have got a legitimate care need, it isn't being met because they've got, you know, criminal, you know, in and out of criminal justice services, drug and alcohol issues, all kinds of other things. It sort of masks that care need that's there. And so for some people, Housing First won't be right because there just isn't the ability to live independently without significant support. And I think the other thing is, and we're doing quite a lot of work into this at the moment, there's a lot of discussion within the Oxfordshire study on it, is where we talk about choice and control with the individual. There are some people who will choose never to live on their own, and we have to have solutions to that, because that's an acceptable choice for somebody to make. We've created it in a lot of people in that they've been institutionalised for such a long time they don't have the confidence to live on their own. But those, somebody was talking about extra care earlier on. I think it was one of the counsellors was talking about an extra care facility. There is this idea of basically a kind of extra care type model, but for people who've got a complex needs that aren't over the age limit of that you would need to be for extra care. So really in Finland, where they say they've gone whole scale Housing First, actually what they did was convert a lot of their hostel blocks into 1-bedroom apartment blocks, and they have on-site Housing First support. Now, to my mind, that isn't quite high fidelity Housing First in the way that we see it in the US model, but what it is people with their own tenancy, their own property, lots of housing rights as a tenant, but in a supportive community in the same way that you would see in extra care, and with the ability to scale that up and down. So we don't have that provided very much in England yet, but it's something that I think a couple of areas are really looking at. Newcastle do that model for adults with learning disability, and it's been working really well. Particularly they've got a project for adults with learning disability and substance and addiction issues, and it's been working really, really well. So I think that is the gap that we've got at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to call an end to questions at this point. There are some more comments and questions in the chat, but I want to give you an opportunity to deliver the rest of your presentation. We are going to finish at 3:30 at the latest. So any time that we've got after Kate's presentation, we'll pick up any more questions until we run out of time. So over to you, Kate.
Great, I'll start sharing my screen again. So I was asked to cover a little bit about Housing First in rural communities. Now I will hold my hands up at this stage and say, I am not an expert on this, but I've done what I can to pull together what we've got. I've pulled some statistics. You know, there's been some quite shocking statistics around the increase of number of homeless people in rural authorities across England. Really significant leap. We're seeing homelessness jump in every demographic. This is hardly surprising. We know that there are issues around affordability and access in rural communities, more so than in some urban communities. You know, there was a report last year that said that rural homelessness had more than doubled, although I have since read things that dispute some of those figures, but certainly it's an issue that's on the increase. The most recent piece of research that's been published on this was published by Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, and it's Out the Woods, and it's about lessons of tackling rural homelessness in the United States. And it's interesting in that actually a lot of the work on this has been done in the US and Canada. Canada, I would say, is probably more replicable than what's been done in the United States, although some of the examples are very extreme in the United States. So one of the first places in Canada that obtained functional zero, which is what they call it when they think they've ended homelessness in a community, was a place called Medicine Hat, which is fairly rural part of Canada, and they have replicated that. The key recommendations that seem to come from that are really around the community being the ones that develop the solutions, so not imposing. So some of the things, for example, in that kind of US high fidelity model is around there not being more than one Housing First property within a city block. Obviously that doesn't translate to a rural community. So there's been various work done, and that report is worth reading. but some of the recommendations for rural communities are really around where there's a limited amount of homelessness services, that your priority should be to invest in outreach services as a first step. Partly that's because you won't know what your level of need is until you've actively boots on the ground trying to find that need. It's easier to be a hidden rough sleeper in a rural community than it is in an urban one. The other thing is that actually you get more bang for your buck from an outreach service. They're very flexible. They can go and work in different areas, but also they are they're almost like the emergency branch of any service. So if you have a service wedded to a building, what you're going to get is the same people attending it, but you're never going to get the reach to the people that you might be missing. So one is to really do that. And it's interesting, where I'm working in kind of city regions and counties, you see the cities investing a lot in outreach, but not the more rural communities. And actually what the Intel is suggesting is that we maybe want to flip that, because in a city, you're more likely to know where the services are that you should access. But yeah, that co-design of services with local communities and also people with lived experience. So there will be so remember this from some of the work I did in Canada, just bits of intel around where people are currently sleeping, or where people that are harder to keep on top of in a rural area. Where is the squat? Where is the abandoned building? Where are people finding shelter? And really, your outreach teams are your ear on the ground for that. So they're the kind of key recommendations that have come from the studies that I've read. We did a feasibility study. We love a feasibility study, as you can tell at Crisis, for Torbay at the request of their local authority. Now, I realise that's not quite the same, but it is more rural than some of the areas where we're seeing rollout of Housing First. And what that found was that there were lots of interventions that could be successful, but there weren't really very good examples in Torbay of people moving through each stage of support and out of homelessness for good. That actually there was a lot of cycle, a lot of revolving door. We see that everywhere, but in those smaller communities, certainly anecdotally, I was at the launch of this report, councillors talking about people by name that they've known for 20 plus years. That is an abject example of system failure, but essentially because everybody knew that person, that everybody rallied every time they had a dip and then helped them with something temporary, but we weren't breaking that cycle. So significant use of emergency accommodation found in Torbay. So actually less people fall through the net. We provide something in smaller communities, but actually what that means is that the proportion of single families in emergency accommodation in Torbay is single people to families is much higher. The 65% of temporary accommodation was being used for singles in Torbay. That's really quite marked. In cities we'd see that at about 20%. So there's almost like a generosity of supply of temporary solutions, but not much thought put into permanent solutions. And so it's not falling into that trap. Quite often when you're dealing with smaller numbers, you can pull more kind of things out the bag when people really need something in an emergency, but actually what do you then do about the longevity of that support? And the recommendations from the Torbay study said that Housing First would achieve nearly 2 times more, that's not very good English, is it, cost effective. It would be doubly cost effective at achieving a successful outcome for homeless people within complex needs for Torbay than the current provision. So, lots and lots of front end stuff, but not a lot of permanency. So I think they are just things to bear in mind in rural communities. There are really good examples of successful Housing First delivery in rural communities. So Scotland, I've got a colleague who unfortunately has been off sick and I really wanted to speak to her before this presentation. She's been doing a lot about reviewing all the rapid rehousing plans in Scotland, and clearly some of those counties cover really remote communities and they are all building in Housing First, so I can get more information from her to feed through. Scotland, some stuff happening, really good stuff happening in Wales, particularly in the valleys of South Wales. Torbay and also West Sussex have got some quite successful delivery of Housing First. It's very much led by third sector providers, but they are finding really high levels of success there. Further afield, Canada, Finland, USA. Canada, I would say really look at. Finland's an interesting one because their rural and our rural are really quite different. Finland rural is, kind of got to use ice picks to get to you, and it could be very, very remote. But some of the Canadian stuff is very interesting, which is more kind of small farming communities, etc. So in summary, what I've been able to pull together around rural housing first delivery is that some particular considerations for you guys that we might not see so much in cities are insufficient housing stock for scattered site approaches, and that does tend to be around, you know, affordable or social stock being in one very particular focused area. Lack of landlord buy-in, although I'm hoping that's not the case here. We've got a lot of landlord representation, but that can be harder in those rural communities. Inability to reach efficiencies of scale due to low client numbers. That West Sussex model is interesting, and some of the stuff that Housing First England have pulled together. You know, we're seeing really high levels of success with projects that are employing 1 or 2 Housing First support workers with very small amounts of clients to support. So it can be done even at tiny scale. Transportation challenges, I think, are something that you're not going to get around. It's always a challenge in rural communities. Personalisation budgets are a really big one with this. I've seen some good work up in Cumbria around mopeds and funding for driving lessons and things like that, where in a city that might not be a necessity, but actually for long-term sustained independent living in a rural community, that might be exactly what people want to invest their personalisation budget in, and you need to think about that. Staff recruitment can be harder in rural communities, and also availability and flexibility of health and addiction services, so that really needs to go into your thought processes when you're planning. Because what you don't want, and we've seen this in bits of Oxfordshire, is this assumption that there's stock over here but we couldn't put people in it because that drug outreach team doesn't cover that area. Right, okay, well, who's got the contract and how do we change that? Because that is the tail wagging the dog. And we should be really driven by, if there is appropriate housing that people want to accept, how do we make the answer to that yes? And how do we make the services wrap around? The other thing is, you know, an over-dependence on certain GP practices to deal with, you know, complex people or rough sleepers. Actually, primary health services have got a duty, and we just need to maybe do some in-reach work from city centre practices who are very used to these kind of health conditions and challenges that come with long-term rough sleeping, to provide support to colleagues. And I did a bit of that in up in the northwest around, you know, more suburban practices, really genning up from colleagues in town and city centres. Okay. So that's the end of my little rural section. It was a bit of a whistle stop, but hopefully it was helpful. I'm conscious of time and wanting to get through some stuff and take questions. So I'm wondering whether or not, if I move into this next section, which is really looking at best practice against the fidelity principles, and then we can maybe regroup for some questions after that. Michael didn't shake his head, so I'm just
I'm nodding. That's
good. Okay, I'm going to stick another video on now if I can. It's an interesting one. It's about Amsterdam, and it's about the city approaching Amsterdam to rolling out Housing First. I really like this video because I think it talks very honestly about the challenges that you have. But also, I think makes you think that, God, somewhere like Amsterdam, which is big and metropolitan, would have started really big and they didn't. So I'm just going to click play and hope everybody can hear this.
The standard approach has proven to fail. So that is a challenge for us, and it's a very clear challenge. So that whatever we do, it has to be another way.
When we started out about 15 years ago with a small group of people, Amsterdam was doing very well. The town was growing, it was increasing wealth, and we wondered how it was possible that we could not find better solutions for homelessness than we did at the time. And so we went to look around in different cities and parts of the world, how they cope with homelessness. And we ended up in New York, and we met a person who was the leader of an organization called Pathways to Housing. And the general idea was fight homelessness with providing homes.
And when we saw Pathway to Housing in New York, we saw, it was impressive. We were impressed. It was a good thing to see, but it did not convince us totally.
If you look at the problem of homelessness and the problem of addiction, that was like very visible on the street. And you would tell a person, these people that are now living on the street, we're going to put them in an individual house, and we're going to have as little rules as possible. We're just going to trust them, give them perspective, give them faith. And they said, yeah, but that can never work, because these people are ill. And that's also something, if you look at our society, we're based on risk management. We're totally oriented on preventing anything from happening.
Well, they were afraid that these people were just too damaged, and that they experienced too many things in life, and therefore they would not be able to function in society, and that the society would have to pay the price of the non-functioning people.
I think the main problem was the way we looked at homeless people, the way we thought about homeless people. We thought homeless people were hopeless people, people who were hardly responsible for their own actions. And the whole doctrine, if you can say that, was aimed at taking away responsibilities, educating people, actually punishing them by putting them into night shelters and then reintegrate them, re-educate them according to the stepping stone theory.
So for me, the biggest innovative way is by believing and having the confidence that people that have suffered so much, they can also be an added value in society. So it's actually how we would say in Spanish, we turn the tortilla upside down. So we go totally around. We say, no, you think that this person is not going to function, and actually this one is the one who's going to really function.
What we actually did was stop trying to prove it in theory, and we had just enough leverage to get it started in real life. And from there on, it actually proved itself.
Indeed, the Housing Corporation, the Dageraad at the time, and Wessel, and there were certain people who really took the initiative and said, we're going to develop it, whether the city helps us or not.
Made the deal that we would not start communicating about our project. We said, no, first we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it, and we're not gonna communicate, because if it then goes bad, it will work against the model. So first see if it works, and if it then works, we start communicating.
The first results were very good, because after a year, no one left the house. Just one who said, no, I don't want to live here anymore. I need to go to some place else. Okay, that's your choice.
What we especially did in the team is constantly inviting people working at the city council, sending movies about successes with clients, inviting them to their houses, having a drink with their houses. Because at the end of all, we all get carried away with our day practice, and we don't take time to actually show the successes, and we don't make a nice invitation to the people of the city council to say, do you want to have a drink at this house with this client of ours? And our client was just very happy to show all the successes. And by informing, communicating, inviting, integrating these people, little by little, they started realizing that it could work.
We were still very skeptical, so we said, let's have some research. We asked the University of Nijmegen to research the first 70 or 80 clients who were included in Housing First. And the research really was quite convincing, of course. The first 80 people, all Housing First created stability for people and their surroundings. Public nuisance was minimal. People retained their houses. People improved their health. So that they were very, very strong results, and that was an important moment for us. That was convincing.
Nowadays, we have from 2016 a program to change the care in Amsterdam on Housing First policy, and we do it together.
From a city council point of view, it's cheaper. In the long run, Housing First is cheaper than anything else. When you place someone in a 24-hour facility, it costs like €60,000 a year. Housing First is half that money, and I hope and believe in the long run it will be cheaper.
People that were in the beginning were outcasts of society, did not fit in any program, did not fit in a society, but did fit in the Housing First model. And being in the Housing First model, they started being active citizens again, in their way, not in my way, probably not in your way, but in their way.
Housing First is for me like a lifesaver.
Dat huis is je herstel. Als jij dat huis niet hebt, kan je niet herstellen.
That means a new life for me. Yeah.
Now I have this home. I found a normal life for myself, and that's why I'm very thankful for the chance that they give me.
Hopefully other people like that video as much as I do. I think there's some really good bits of that. One thing that I think is really interesting, and it came up this morning, was around how we deal with the rest of the community. And whenever I've been in a room with people from Finland and they be asked that, come to the UK and asked by various communities, what about neighbours, what about NIMBYs, and what Finnish people look at us like we've got two heads and say, well, we just explained it and everybody was happy. And you think, yeah. And when you watch that video about Amsterdam, you think actually the idea that they didn't go big bang with this. They said, we're going to just start it and let it work. I think that's very interesting, particularly where we where I've spoken to councillors and people who are responsible for kind of neighbourhoods and communities, really being quite concerned about the responses of neighbours. And actually, this is maybe something to just start and let it prove itself. And not worry too much about some of that stuff. So I think that's really interesting. The other thing that I think is a really nice point in that video is that idea that people who are housed through a Housing First tendency can establish themselves as part of the community in their own way. And just because they don't live the way that you or I might live, that's absolutely fine. And we have to allow people that level of kind of autonomy over their own lives. And what we do where we plough people through very prescriptive programs of support or live in a very controlled way is that people are never getting that ability to just be who they want to be in their own way. And that's incredibly damaging and destructive, but also why are we surprised that we don't get long-term outcomes from people when we're not giving them that kind of agency over their own lives? And I think, it's a really interesting reflection for Housing First, that where, there was a conversation this morning about people who maybe they wouldn't put forward for the programme because maybe they wouldn't be right for it. I think we don't know with Housing First unless we try, and the key should be choice for individuals. So hopefully that was helpful, and I'll send these slides over so you'll have the video. The next section, and I will whiz through it because I think there's probably going to be kind of more useful to do questions at the end of this, but really is just breaking down those core principles that I talked about earlier and really giving a bit more detail around what good looks like on those principles. So the first one being housing is a human right, and so that comes from the space that everybody deserves housing. I think that video again demonstrates that really clearly, that nobody should need to prove that they are housing ready, that people should have choice in where and how they live, and really what is the option if not housing. And as the city councilman says very clearly on that video, the choice is to spend more money on something that people don't really want, and keeping that clear in our heads. But what does that look like in practice, and how do we kind of hit that fidelity? And I'm really only skimming the surface of this because of time. There are very, very good kind of fidelity monitoring tools. Housing First Hub Europe publish a really good one. There is a Pathways one from America, but it's not as good as the European one because it's more easily translatable. And actually Housing First England have a fairly high level one. So I would suggest that when you're delivering services, you look at them. But really what housing as a human right looks like in practice is multiple offers of housing for Housing First service users and ensuring choice. So, not a kind of default one offer, take it or leave it. Dispersed accommodation. Although again, choice in that, so not being too rigidly strict with it in the way that the kind of Pathways US model is, and also a choice of properties tailored to each client. This is hard when you're only delivering a small amount, but if what we say is here are our 4 Housing First properties, then client number 4 gets a very small choice. And so being as broad with that as is humanly possible will give you a higher level of success. Flexible support being provided for as long as needed, so that there's no set amount of support that's right for people or determined in advance. But the amount of time and support will vary for each person. We should expect that and be able to provide that. There should be no set end date for support, and support moves with the person and at their pace. Now, I am very aware that under some of the funding agreements, there is a contract end date. How that's presented to tenants is what I would be really careful of. What we see time and time again is people who have gone through homelessness services being told by their support worker, I'm allowed to work with you for the next 6 months. And what that immediately does is say to that person, no point trusting me, investing any time or energy in this, because I'll be gone. And with Housing First, we have to make it feel different than that. So support contracts need to be flexible to allow that kind of ebb and flow that we will expect. You know, when people are new in a tenancy, they might need a huge amount of support, and then it might tail off for times, but that it'll need to be able to move back up and down. It won't be linear. We can be clear that it won't kind of just taper off. There'll be peaks and troughs. And a tenant needs to choose how they receive support. So for a housing support team, they will be supporting different people in completely different ways. So again, you know, some of the Canadian services are really led by clinical psychologists. I remember sitting with one clinical psychologist who told me that they did nothing but wash somebody's dishes for 6 months. That's kind of fine because they got the ability to make contact, to build a trusting relationship, but really what that might look and feel like will be very different for different people. Separation of housing support and support, again, this is one that we talked about, that there is a real challenge with current funding structures and infrastructure at the moment, but it is the norm in other areas. So things like adult learning disability services and other areas of social care where people are provided with a house that meets their needs, but actually they get to choose who their support provider is. How do we build that more regularly into homelessness services? Changing support needs should not force anybody to move home. So that goes back to the question earlier around what does sustainable mean or stable mean. It means, you know, it's not dependent on anything apart from you living there and paying your rent. Often people in temporary housing end up with the least rights and choices. So, you know, where we talk about shelters and hostels, actually people are on lease agreements that they don't have, or license agreements, they don't have any rights as a tenant, or far fewer than the rest of us would have. You know, there's very few housing situations where, you know, swearing at a staff member or slamming the wrong door could mean that your housing is at risk. But actually we do that all the time to people in the homelessness system. And what it should mean when we separate housing and support more successfully is that less money is spent on buildings and more is spent on people. So that goes back again to the question earlier around where we've kind of jam them together and we paint ourselves into a corner where, well, these houses only work because they're funded in a certain way. But also it talks about where we looked at, you know, the Oxfordshire model and various different bits of research we've done where like very, very small amounts of money are spent on that flexible outreach or that flexible floating support. It's because your commissioning conundrum always starts with, well, we've got a 100-bed hospital here and a 50-bed hospital here, and they cost X amounts of what's left in the pot. And actually, if we could change that, we could change the way we funded services. So good fidelity to separation of housing and support would see regular communication between landlord and Housing First team and the tenant. We talked about that in depth this morning. I think that's something they really took away to give more thought to how they made sure that happened all the time. And build that in. You know, this is about trusting relationships all the way around that tenancy. The issues can be addressed quickly and resolved as early as possible. You know, we would be foolish to think that there would be no challenges with Housing First, but what we should do is be primed to try and minimise the impact of them as much as we can. And having that team around the person approach. So who might be needed to support this individual, and how do we know that we have rapid access to them when we need to? And really putting a lot of planning into each tenancy that way. Choice and control for service users, so that people in the most difficult circumstances often have the fewest choices. You know, if you're rough sleeping, it might be night shelter or nothing. You know, single people are entitled to less through our system than families, etc. But that really accepting that choices are personal and will be informed by people's experiences, good or bad. So you know what, if that means that when somebody moves into a property, they sleep on the sofa or on the floor for an amount of time, that's okay, that's their choice, it's informed by their own previous trauma. We could talk about how it might be more comfortable to sleep in that bed that is in that nice bedroom, but it's absolutely fine for somebody to sleep on their sofa for the rest of their life if they so wish. And that we shouldn't be enforcing our norms on other people. We haven't had their experiences. We talked a lot this morning around that kind of building of a trusting relationship within Housing First, and actually getting it right and getting it right first time is really important. So things like the gas and electric being switched on the day of moving, I recognise that that's challenging for a housing association, and that actually all your other tenants have to just put up and shut up with that sometimes. But Housing First tenants will be more vulnerable to thinking that things are not going to work out. And so we have to make sure that we are kind of easing the path for them as much as we can. And that isn't about them being, you know, special and wanting extra good treatment. It's about them being used to really poor treatment and us having to build in extra care to show that we mean what we've been saying and that we can live up to our promises. And I think sometimes that is a really difficult thing for a busy, stretched service to recognise. I've had many conversations with housing management teams who say, well, no other tenants get that. But we can predict that these tenancies will fail if we don't go the extra mile. So what do we do to put that stuff in there? And that small choices can make really huge differences. So not to underestimate that. You know, things like people being able to choose the colour of their paint in their house, or, you know, well, I've always in the hostel wanted a kettle in my room, but I'm not allowed. Well, you can do what you want. This is your flat. You know, why don't we get you a teas made, or whatever that might be? You know, really silly things that people might think are not a big deal become a huge deal. I haven't shown the video on this one where there's a guy with a cat, but I'm a bit obsessed with the cats of Housing First, because I actually think the choice to have a pet is something that lots of us take for granted, but actually for a lot of people, they've given up on the idea that they might ever be able to have a budgie in a cage or a cat. And actually the idea that this is your home and you can choose that can be the thing that helps people maintain in a way that we've never really given them the choice to before. So good on choice and control looks like, not that all choices and options are available to people. You know, there's been lots of times that people might want something that is just out of budget, out of reach. That's fine, but have an adult to adult conversation about it. So this is not that you were wrong to ask, but I'm going to explain to you why that isn't possible. And actually we can talk about it like adults, and that means that maybe your requests in future might be more reasonable. Maybe your expectation will be more thought out based on the constraints that nobody could move even with all the will in the world. But that we don't shy away from that, because I think quite often services don't like saying no. So what we do is we say nothing, and that's a big problem, because that's not a trusting adult relationship. And so lots of workforce development needing to go into those new approaches. It feels quite a different way to work. I recruited a load of people in Liverpool City region who, our recruitment process were all led by people with lived experience. We recruited entirely on values, not about skills or previous experience. We had the people that we knew were passionate about Housing First. And still, for the first several months, I spent my whole time saying, yeah, that's allowed. Yeah, that's allowed. No, there's no rule. Yeah, just make, you know, because people were really formed by their previous experiences of, yeah, but what's the actual limit, or what's the actual amount of times that I can do that? Or could I really spend the money on, you know, a trip to the seaside, if that's what that person wants to do today, and that's going to mean that you've got a good support session, you know, get the train up to Southport, no problem. And really getting staff to understand that they've got choice and control as well. Assertive approach to support being used so that nobody's housing is at risk if they don't engage with support. But I think, like I said earlier, you wouldn't be on a Housing First programme if we didn't think that you needed support and you yourself hadn't admitted that you had some support needs. So people choose how and when to engage. For some people that might be like, I've no interest in anything before 2 p.m, don't even try it, that's fine. But that where people are resistant to that, or where people are saying, no, I'm fine, thanks, I don't need anything, that we use an active engagement approach so people are continually offered support. And actually what that might look like is people saying, I have no problems and I need no support. All I needed was a house and I've got that now. Thank you very much. So you can go away. But what that should translate to is really regular support and safety and tenancy checks. So that just because somebody says they don't need you, you continue to turn up. I don't know, I'm from a big Irish family. You can tell your aunties all you want, you're fine, but they will continue to keep turning up on your doorstep because that's just the way it happens. And that's what care looks like. You know, that's what really strong, trusting relationships look like, which is that you might be telling me you're fine, but I'm just going to come and check. And that isn't about being patriarchal, but it's really about showing care, that we're going to just keep checking in. And if you're fine, that's fine, and we'll go away again. So tenancy being supported, not just the tenant, the caseloads are managed. So that means doesn't mean less time for a tenant, because with overstretched services, there is this kind of efficiency that's been built in. So, well, if that guy doesn't really need you, how about taking on this extra tenant? That's why those protective caseloads are really, really key for Housing First. And actually to reassure landlords and others that disengagement is actually very rare. There'll be periods of time where people might be distant from support, but it's very, very rare that people just say, I'm not interested, don't need anything, I'm fine. And to be honest, when they do, sometimes something will then spur the fact that we've got a good excuse to say, actually, you know, you said you didn't need anything, but then you ended up needing to kind of get a crisis loan, or you got yourself into trouble with that debt, didn't you? So how about we kind of really look at that again? Strength-based approaches being used, so really believing that there is a possibility for positive change for everybody. You do not want Housing First support staff that don't believe that to their core. Because if they don't, they're not going to do this job properly. So values-based recruitment, I can't stress enough. That people are supported to identify their strengths and goals, that there will be things that people can do. People who've lived on the streets for a long time are very strong individuals in general, because they've had to be. So what is it that you've got that is a strength that we can draw out of you? Are you really good at getting people to do you favours? Right, that means you're good at building relationships, great. And that people are supported to develop their self-esteem and confidence. So, you know, people avoid a lot. So this idea that, you know, like, I cannot do paperwork, I cannot pay bills, right? Okay, well, you can sit with me whilst I do it for you every single time until you get to the stage that you can understand what the process is. So that the support team doesn't do for, it does with. So yes, I can help you pay your bills, but I'm not going to just go off in my office and do them for you. I'm going to sit with you here and we'll do them together. That people are supported and not enabled, and that the pace of that is dictated by a tenant. So if what that means is that you sit next to somebody and pay their gas bill for the next year, 2 years, that's okay, but you don't just do the short workaround, which is like, I'll just do it tonight in my office, when, you know, you don't get, you know, it's easier for me. And this is the final one on the kind of principles, that this harm reduction approach. I talked about this a little bit before, that it's really common in drug and alcohol services, but fundamentally we have to believe that being housed reduces harm. We can prove that, and that this process is a harm reduction process. So even if somebody's in their tenancy and they are using drugs, they're using alcohol, they are not feeding themselves well, they are really, really neglecting themselves, they are safer than they were when they were doing that on the streets. And it's about kind of reiterating that to them and to us, and really working from that point. People don't need to abstain from drugs and alcohol. I'm being really clear that that is not a requirement. Good support looks like having a conversation about whether or not it's sensible to spend 90% of your income on something that is killing you. That is absolutely acceptable, but that doesn't mean that you have to stop using. But we will continue to talk to you about how that might be less harmful for you. And that staff support individuals who self-harm to undertake practices that minimise greater harm. Again, getting the right staff is really important here. You will see people doing terrible things to themselves that you wish you could stop them doing, but you can't. So you have to be prepared to kind of walk that journey with them. So what good harm reduction looks like is that we do see significant improvement in other areas of people's physical, mental and health and well-being, but it's not a requirement for the programme. And that safety ultimately is improved for all. So we might not stop you doing harmful things, but you will do them in a safer, more controlled way. Okay, so that is the end, I guess, of my formal presentation. It was a bit of a rattle through, but hopefully it was helpful. there is a little bit of there's an additional Menti that we can do, which is just some kind of what are the takeaways and what are the next steps, but it might be worth just doing some questions before that.
Thank you, Kate. Tons of information and really worthwhile as always. So thank you for spending your day from Liverpool in East Anglia. We had 1 or 2 questions left over from the earlier session. I'm feeling very guilty because James Francis put his hand up in the earlier session and then has had to leave. One of the great strengths of these Zoom calls is people can join as opposed to giving up half a day to get to somewhere. And we started with 55, but we're down to 49 people. And James unfortunately had another meeting, so I will never know what question he had. John earlier made some comments. John, I don't know which organisation you're from, but he was talking, and you may want to come in now, John. He was talking about he had been using temporary accommodation for Housing First, and the support was sort of lined up for 2 years. And I thought the question was really about what happens after the 2 years. John, do you want to expand on that?
Yes, it's not that we're using it at the moment, but it's a work in progress at the moment. We're acquiring 10 units of accommodation through a local housing association, and they're being acquired at this moment in time. But my question was, the idea being that those people will stay in that accommodation for 2 years before moving on to permanent. I don't want the move to permanent to be a cliff edge, because I think that's just a recipe for disaster. The intention is that the Housing First support officers will have a bit of overlap after that 2 year period. But after that, because they can't support them indefinitely, is it wise to have another support organisation to take the baton on with the client on an ongoing basis?
It's a really tough one because it's clearly being dictated by funding. I'm not sure if this is funded through Next Steps and whether or not we're talking about the same challenge. If so, my short answer is that I really hope the government sees sense and change the restrictions on that funding. If it's not Next Steps funding, my other question would be, does the tenant really have to move, or could the support move on to other people? Because that's always my first question back to anything that requires a move from the tenant. Why? What is it about that building that means that building has to be the one that stays in that programme? And if that can be addressed, then that's somewhere to start. I guess if none of that can be overcome, then it's about really adhering to the other principles as much as is humanly possible. So the higher fidelity to the other principles, the better. To not start with a deficit, so not to start relationships saying, I can only support you for 2 years. To take, I guess, some solace from the fact that internationally, the average amount of support engagement for Housing First is about 17 months. So 2 years might be okay, but what we should never do, 17 months is an average. So what that means is that there's a lot of people that need more and there's a lot of people that need less. But actually for a lot of people, 2 years might do it if you do really good quality Housing First support. You would always want them to have rapid access into something else if that support stepped away. The big challenge with it is that it's so relational Housing First. So in an ideal world, you'd want those workers to be available to the same people. But that doesn't always work because people move jobs and win the pools and leave the sector and whatever.
How many people win the pools?
Maybe not anymore, but they used to. It's postcode lottery now, probably, isn't it? But so you can never plan for everything, but how much of it can you build into your planning stage, I would say, and how much work can be done to make sure that the right support packages are in place for those people. So if it's only 20 people, actually within a 2 year period, you should know them incredibly well. So who is it that really needs ongoing community mental health support? Who is it that really, and build that in during their time that they're with Housing First, because ultimately Housing First is permanent housing and permanent embedded into a community, and you should be able to do a lot of that work. We say it's for as long as somebody needs, but the aspiration is that not everybody will need really high level support forever, because quite a lot of their issues were to do with being unhoused. And if they get the place of safety where they can address some of their other support issues, then actually maybe we can step back a little bit anyway. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think they're just the things I'd be trying.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Michael, do you mind if I just sort of
Yeah,
jump in there, just because it's very specific to the point that John has raised. So sorry if I'm kind of treading on
No, I
people's
was going
toes.
to ask you anyway, Sue, to pick up on your comment further up about properties as well.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. So just for full disclosure, we are the housing association that Broadland is working with, so that's why I'm answering the specific point. It is Next Steps funding, and it is very specifically for 2-year accommodation. Now that's an ideal. It doesn't mean that as at 2 years later they will move on, but the idea is they will move on, but that property will be available for 30 years to house the next tranche of housing-led clients. It's certainly not our vision that we work exactly to that 2 years. Some may move on earlier if we find the right accommodation, and others may be there longer. I think we're looking at that as an average. For us, certainly as a housing provider, we have our own tenancy sustainment service. They are not qualified to do housing first type support. Let's be honest about that. They're quite generic. But what we would hope would happen, that within that 2 years, we might be in a position where we can hand those clients off to more generic support because they no longer need that level of intensity. That might not work, but John, to give you some reassurance that anybody who perhaps doesn't need that level of intervention anymore, then yeah, we would pick them up internally and move them on, hopefully within our own stock or certainly within the social housing sector. My comment about the property type, and I was thinking about a scheme that I have in Camden, and we have a client in there who perhaps is one of the most challenging housing first clients that we have. She is probably somebody that Housing First is absolutely made for, but presents with every imaginable challenge that you could possibly imagine. What we found with her was, for example, there's a communal entrance to the block of flats. That clearly doesn't work for this person. She is, amongst other things, she is a substance misuser, she is a sex worker. So we've learned from that actually understanding more about the client and how their behaviours will manifest is really important to choosing the accommodation. And then also there's that wider community piece around what's the history of that block, because we're typically talking about flats. What has that block been through before? Where should we put them? Should it be ground floor accommodation? Because that way visitors to the home not interfering so much, whereas if they're on the upper floor, there'd be people going up and down the stairs. So we have, it's been a bit of a very quick learning process for us in terms of the right type of property for the particular client, and that will vary, as we know.
Yeah, I think I can really empathise with all those points. That they're all fairly standard housing first type challenges, and I guess there's two things I'd say. One is this is where the conflation of housing first being linked to a property is a massive problem. So the Next Steps funding in itself is problematic because there hasn't been that understanding. And the other thing, so the central government have not understood that these 10 properties being used for the next 30 years for Housing First isn't really how Housing First works. An additional 10 properties in the mix, so that means there is always an ability to have a group of 10 people being supported by Housing First is how we should be pitching that. So continual battle fighting around how the person with the most vulnerability isn't the one to bear the brunt is the thing. So how do we not enforce a stressful move on somebody? How do we just replace that property with like for like? But also that thing about ground floor is really interesting. The percentage of Housing First tenants that need a ground floor for a number of reasons is really high. So one of the things that we're looking at in some work that we're doing nationally at the moment around increased supply of Housing First is this need for self-contained ground floor, which we don't build very often. There was a tower block in Stockbridge Village, if anybody knows it, which was super exciting because they converted their garages into one beds on the ground floor, and we were delighted because that meant there were ground floor flats for the first time forever in an area where we had a load of people that needed them, but also bungalows and all that kind of stuff. So it is a challenge with our stock, but what I would say is that continually learning is very important, but what do we learn? So do we learn for that individual she requires a ground floor, or do we learn that all Housing First tenancies should be looking at ground floor property? Because I think if you look back on the past sort of 20 or 30 years of homelessness delivery, the road to hell was paved with good intentions, where because of a common issue, legislation or policy was passed, and what we end up with then is a generic one size fits all, and we've really got to battle against that with Housing First, because the choice has got to be with the client. And equally, one of the things that was really helpful for Housing First properties in the Northwest was that lots of local authorities wouldn't house families with small children above a certain floor in tower blocks. And actually a lot of Housing First tenants, particularly women, wanted to be on a higher floor because they felt safer. So having that level of choice for people needs to be built in wherever we can. So I really understand the challenge where you're doing a small amount of delivery and what you need to do is bring in extra stock. But if these are our 10 Housing First properties, the level of choice is always going to be severely limited for those individuals. And that's the bit that we need to be a bit smarter. And that goes back to that whole separating the support for funding and housing so that we can do a bit more jiggery pokery with them.
We've got a couple of minutes left. I'm keen that we should have our last Menti question, but Nikki Patton, I think you've got a question first. So this will be our last question.
Thanks, Michael. Sorry, everyone, I can't put my camera on at the moment because I've got some internet issues and my daughter's on a maths lesson, so apologies for that. It was just really to say, I think it's been really helpful, Keith, thank you today. But I think just thinking where we are at the moment, sorry, I should say I'm from Kings Lynn and West Norfolk Borough Council, is around obviously the everyone in. And I think a lot of what you've talked about today, Kate, we've seen with the everyone in, and I can speak from a West Norfolk experience, that the principle around everyone, you know, has a right to a home, and a lot of people that we've placed into accommodation, direct lets, which we've done, you know, very successfully with Broadland, with Freebridge and other landlords, people are doing well. People who we thought were going to struggle are doing well. Some people aren't, and obviously we've got to look at that, but generally we've been really encouraged, and I think there's a real opportunity there, and it's that first principle that those people have been given a home and they've been given an opportunity. And I think it's perhaps, Michael, one for us, you know, with the no homelessness in Norfolk, to take away and think about is the opportunity that the direct lets have offered, because we are kind of a one step there in many ways, and it's about tackling that support for some of those people that we've placed in there that are starting to wobble, and it's those peaks and troughs, Kate, that you rightly talked about. So I think there is a real opportunity, and I'd hate for us to miss it from, you know, the work that's been done under everyone in, Michael. And it's really how, in the interim, I know it's going to be a long road and a battle with the funding, and we need all of the longer term sustainable funding, but it's what we as local authorities and the providers can do in the short term to look at that housing first support, and the support following the person as opposed to the property. And I think that's, you know, that's really important, and we've got a real opportunity with the success that there has been across Norfolk with everyone in.
I quite agree.
I couldn't agree more. I think on that everybody in point, the only good thing about this awful pandemic has been the rapid response the first time around for everybody in, and what that has proven to a lot of people, that you know, homeless providers as well, people they'd given up on and thought they could not maintain actually can. And when we give people a bit of dignity and their own space, even in a hotel room, which is not an ideal place to live, that actually it's incredible how many people are not service resistant but just were being offered services that weren't right for them. And so how do you, can't advocate enough for floating support. If people aren't putting that in their ISI 4 bids, they should be, because you want that support move with those individuals from everybody in.
I quite agree, and I think there's something for all of us to, you know, the last 11 months have been really tough for everybody, but there's been some things that we've learned that have been really constructive and useful. And what we've got to make sure is that when we get beyond the pandemic, we don't just forget them and go back to the old ways without building on them. Kate, do you want to do your last Menti?
Why not? Whilst
I've never seen Menti before. I'm really excited by it.
It's good, isn't it? A colleague of mine introduced me to it, and I've got a bit Menti happy now, but I do like it. Right. Yeah, it's brought on by the pandemic.
It went down really well earlier. We got lots of good feedback from it afterwards, Kate.
I'm going to share this one. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so the code is at the top of the screen to save me jumping into two different things. And it's what are the most important next steps for me and my organisation. So based on all the information I've dumped on you, what are the things that you're taking away? What are you going to do? Because I've done this exact same question this morning. I think it'd be interesting that we can kind of bring them both together. So the code is 8655184. I'm hoping that there's just sort of winging its way through the ether to me up in Liverpool from where you guys are, because at the moment it looks a bit frozen. Refresh.
Still typing.
Cool. Okay, people are just thinking and typing. There we go. Things are coming up. Good stuff. Yeah, we can all join the bandwagon to try and get them to change the rough sleep and accommodation programme or the next steps funding to make it sustainable. The really depressing bit is that the reason that it isn't sustainable and flexible at the moment is that it comes from an underspent pot from Homes England, which I was talking about 5 years ago about how could they make the funding transferable to different addresses, street addresses, so that we didn't end up with this predicament. And it seems like they still haven't really copped onto that. Great. Okay, so building relationships, different sectors, sharing more information. Do more. This is great. Do more housing first. Giving people confidence and support, working with partners. Brilliant. I can scroll down where people keep adding. The range of homes, yeah, the choice bit's really hard. The choice bit with this is really difficult, particularly where it's at small scale. Big culture change needed in organisations, yeah. I think, you know, it's very good that the CSJ report is calling for workforce development, because I think it's really needed. Excellent. Loads of people are taking really proactive steps after this. This is good to see. Make sure I send these over to you, Michael, so that you can hold people to them. It's all anonymous, so you won't quite know who you are, but it'd be good to see, you know, to revisit and see whether or not any of this has led to any really kind of shared action on this.
There are some really good points there, and I think a really interesting one slightly up on your screen is about culture change, and actually recognising that that is fundamental. Whatever processes you come up, if you haven't delivered some culture change, it's really not going to work. I'm really sad to say it's 3:31, and I was told that we had to finish by 3:30, so I've completely failed in facilitating, but I think it's been a really good afternoon. A huge thank you for Kate for this afternoon, and also working with the teams this morning. Really appreciate it. I mean, one of the benefits, as I said earlier, of Zoom or Teams is you can join at a moment's notice from anywhere actually in the country, I suppose in the world really. So perhaps sometime we should get somebody to speak to us from Canada about their experience. Big thank you also to Paula and her team for doing all the organisation, and for everybody who's participated this afternoon. It's really, really appreciated, and I'm feeling quite positive, having seen the Minty answers, that everyone's taking away something from it. Paula will circulate the slides and the link to the recordings. So whilst there were 55 of us on the call at one point, if you want to share it each with one other person, that would take it to 110. And if we're delivering culture change, perhaps that's what we should be trying to do. We are hoping to organise another Homes for Cathy workshop probably in the middle of May, and we're thinking of either talking about migrant homelessness and people with no recourse to public funds, or potentially linking in with the Norfolk Strategic Housing Partnership and the Solutions Forum and getting an update on that activity. But I think quite a lot of people on the call are already quite up to speed with that. But thank you very much indeed. Hugely appreciated seeing you all, and I'll see you soon. And with that, we'll close.